In 1850, a grand enterprise was started in Plainville, Connecticut. It was started by a man named Jared Goodrich and two friends, H.M. Welch and Edward Pierce. These men founded the Plainville Manufacturing Company, which would manufacture underwear through the 1930s. This big plant stood very imposingly on West Main Street, all the way from the railroad tracks down to Pierce Street. Goodrich was a man of many, many different kinds of adventures. Some were business and some were otherwise. And in 1840, he was already making clocks in Plainville. He was making carriages in Plainville. And at 49, the big adventure of his life occurred when he and Captain Dick Norton and several other men went to the West Coast, to the California gold fields, and actually brought home some nuggets. Even in the years when he was involved with a knitting mill, this man was still manufacturing carriage bolts and carriages. There was no holding him back. He was also a partner in an enterprise called the Plainville Trading Company. He died in 1900. During his life, he built two beautiful homes, and the loveliest one was known later on as the Kramer Benzon home on the corner of Whiting and Maple Street. This house has since been moved around the corner onto Maple Street, and you can tell it by its beautiful bay window. Now, another man that was very, very important to our town's industry, the knitting mill, was a man named Benjamin Pollard, who came from England, and he called himself a mechanic inventor. Now, these secrets of the knitting mills and the various processes of knitting and weaving in the British Isles in those days was very, very carefully guarded. It was really like a cloak and dagger thing. Pollard somehow got some of these secrets, brought them to this country in 1848, and very quickly came to Plainville in 1850 and was instrumental in setting up the first knitting machines. J.C. Hart, who is our very first town historian, wrote that he was told that Pollard built the first knitting machine in secret in a barn in New Britain. This was a new branch of American industry, and Plainville was in almost from the start on this. Now, Benjamin had a very much loved son named Luther who went off to the Civil War from Plainville, possibly wearing some of that underwear that his dad's plant was manufacturing, itching all the way, I'm sure. He was discharged with a medical disability after having served with Sherman. On the day of Benjamin Pollard's death in February 1882, at the age of 66, the factory, as the newspaper said, out of regards to his memory, closed for the day, and bearers were his co-workers and superintendents at the plant. Another man who was very, very important in the history of the mill was John Chantrell, who was also an English woolen worker. He held an early and important position in the plant, and he ran he was what they called a mule spinner, not mule skinner. He worked on some sort of a knitting machine or a weaving machine that is lost in history. He was an overseer as well, and not a lot is known about this man except that he left a beautiful home at 47 Maple Street, which was known in this century as the home of Mildred Bedford, and everyone knew Mildred. She was a very popular teacher in town. Chantrell died, we don't know where. We have no death record for him in the town clerk's office, and I don't think he spent his life in Plainville, as did Mr. Pollard. In 1850, the Plainville Manufacturing Company was built on West Main Street in Plainville. It ran all the way from the railroad tracks clear through to Pierce Street. It was a big building. We don't know what that first building looked like, except that it was a large mill. It was made of wood, very flammable. First real source of income outside the home for about 10% of the citizens. One of the old H.M. Welch stores, an old flammable wooden building, was used as an L on the southeast portion of the knitting mill. Now, on Friday, the 13th, in 1857, this wooden building burned to the ground. It happened 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just when the whole building was full of people, high number of people working in the building at that time, and suddenly the cry of fire broke out. Now, a lot of these women had been daydreaming at their machines, maybe wondering, what am I going to serve for supper? How's the baby feeling? He wasn't great this morning, but suddenly, fire, fire, everybody's running, feet pounding on that wooden floor. The women hitch up their long skirts and run down the wooden stairways. Pandemonium has broken out. The newspapers later on said that people were obliged to make tracks in double time out of that building because it spread so rapidly. It all started with two machines that were picking. They were called pickers, and they fluffed up the cotton bales. And two of them hit together and made sparks which flew into the cotton, and the whole building went up. This was an old, dry, wooden building. Confusion everywhere. Now, there's no fire department. There's no hooks. There's no ladders. There's no buckets. There's nothing. Nobody to come and help. Helpless bystanders gasped. They protected their faces from the heat that was generated by that big wooden building burning. Inept lines of volunteers ran to the river with buckets. The river is frozen. The forecasts or the records of the weather at that time tell us that everything in Connecticut was frozen. Terrible cold weather. You can't get any water out of the river. Run with an axe. Bring an axe. Quick. It's too late. Forget it. The building is really burning. The rafters are falling in. The walls are falling in. Great firebrands and sparks are flying through the air to the other flammable buildings in the area, which was a great problem. The little few puny buckets of water that were thrown on that fire just enhanced the roar of the fire. And people were just absolutely helpless. They stood and they watched the mill burn. Now it was getting dark. People stood around. There's still smoldering flames going up. People hung together. The workers in the mill had lost a great deal. They looked to each other for some comfort. And then they finally walked home through the gathering dusk to a bleak winter with no jobs. The main mill building was rebuilt as fast as possible. People were back in there working in a year and a half. It was built of brick with a slate roof. Everything made it as fireproof as possible, given the state of technology at that time. It was a 5-story building with a bell tower that added interest, rather a pretty bell tower, and a strong iron fence enclosed it. It was a big, imposing brick building. John Woodruff of Southington had built that great imposing building for the town of Plainville and for the Plainville Manufacturing Company. Not only was it a large building, but he also built an 85-foot brick chimney that would stand for 75 years and serve us very well. At this time, when they were building the new knitting mill building, they also added much more advanced machines, replacing those that Pollard and Chantrell had brought in. This would also increase production. During the same period, 1857-8, the finishing shop, the original portion of the finishing shop was built. Now, this was the building that ran from West Main Street, fronting on West Main Street. It ran south, making an angle with the main mill building. But wouldn't you think they would have known better? Here they're building a brand new building. They've just had a major fire, and they rebuilt it they built it in wood with a shingle roof. You really would think they knew better. So now we have two major mill buildings. When the Farmington Canal went out of business in 1847, it was very quickly followed by the shiny steel rails of the railroad. This probably had a lot to do with why that particular spot was chosen for the knitting mill. The New Haven and Northampton came as far as Plainville immediately, and access to that type of transportation certainly had a great effect on bringing in the raw material to the mill, and also they could bring their coal directly from the Pennsylvania coal fields, which saved them tremendous amounts of money. There was a siding built right in back of the mill that brought in the raw product, brought in the coal. I wonder, however, if the finished product was taken out on that siding, or was it taken over to the freight station, because they did maintain freight wagons, horses, and a stable, which kind of tells you they were using those freight wagons. In the 1860s, especially during the Civil War, 22 to 28 trains were passing through Plainville, hopefully many of them stopping. In 1852, the Boston, Hartford, and Erie built another line through Plainville, further enhancing that transportation capability and encouraging more economic development in the center of the town. Now we've moved up in history to the Civil War. During the Civil War, there was a great demand for all sorts of goods. The industries in New England really were busy. Of course, in Plainville, we were manufacturing underwear, and this was in great demand for the troop. At the outbreak of the Civil War, there were 93 textile mills in Connecticut with a capital investment of $4 million. In 1850, statistics showed that most operatives made slightly under $20 a month. In 1861, the Plainville Manufacturing Company had a terrific surplus of goods backed up in the warehouses, piles and piles of union suits, drawers, tops, you name it, we had it. In fact, business had been so bad that production actually came to a halt. Suddenly the scene changes. President Lincoln is calling up the troops. He's calling for all sorts of activity to begin. Military fever sweeps the country. Charles Norton, in his book later in life, Charles Norton being our famous Plainville inventor, remembers walking from the Congregational Church back to his home on East Main Street as a child, holding his mother's hand. As they passed the knitting mill, there was great excitement going on. Men were on top of the mill unfurling a giant banner, and the mother stopped and asked what was going on. "Fort Sumter has been fired upon." Well, this changed, of course, the course of American history. It also changed the course of Little Plainville, Connecticut. The steam was put up in the knitting mill, the belts started to roll, the pulleys started to whine, all the girls were called back, all the operatives were put back into the operation, and the mill was in production with union suits for the Union Army. After the war, the Plainville Manufacturing Company and many of the sister textile mills in Connecticut really needed a shot in the arm to counteract the hard times. In 1878, the operatives in the Stockinette building, as our knitting mill was called, took a pay cut. In 1878, everything was reorganized. New machines were brought in, new products were tried, a lot of different ways of advertising and getting to the public was tried. Newspapers of the time said many more people were employed after the changes, and they were turning out a much better and a greater variety of products, quoted as saying, "The ready sale of goods gives proof of superior quality." Efficient management is now paying off. They've changed some of their upper echelon people, gave the company new stability, and its presence is a major factor in the economic times of Little Plainville. In 1877, the Pierce Street building is built. This is the building that runs along Pierce Street even today. The original building was built with 10 bays, one of those bays containing a door onto Pierce Street. Another door opened onto the major mill complex, but strangely enough, none opened onto West Main Street, and at this time the mill, the Stockinette, used the address of 2 West Main Street, but it didn't have an opening onto West Main Street. Between 1890 and 1907, another 2 bays were built on that very pretty building, and a wing was added to the east. Now this is one of the nicest industrial buildings of the Victorian period to ever be built in our town. It has beautiful arched windows and it has dentil pediments built into the brickwork. In 1881, the Plainville Manufacturing Company had one of the first telephones in town, and it was supplied by the Connecticut Telephone Company. At that time, long-distance telephone calls were said to be an adventure. The plant was really keeping up with the times at this point and forging ahead and doing very well. The early switchboards were very tiny and very uncomplicated. In 1885 and 86, an office building was constructed. The company is still forging ahead, you see, a big step forward. It was designed to be fireproof as possible, and it contained an elevator. Now, this was a great innovation in our small town. Not many elevators have ever been in Plainville. It faced the main street between the main plant and the finishing building, and the workers moved in May 1886. The Herald reported the new building has iron shutters, and we don't know why the new building had iron shutters. Were they to keep vandals out or fire in, or nobody's explained this to us. The enlargement is complete, and the people have moved into it. There was also an enlargement of the main building that was completed at this time, and new machines were moved in. Now, in 1888, Harrison was elected, and a large delegation went from our small town by train to the inauguration. Now, one imagines all the excitement and all the talk in the neighborhoods, who was going, who wasn't going, and everybody got out those top hats and brushed them off. But imagine the gowns having to be packed. The gowns were very intricate, long, full. Probably hundreds of pieces of tissue paper were involved in packing these in the great big trunks. And then I imagine a group of people went down to the station and saw this group entrained to the capital city. In 1890, the stockholders meeting had nothing but good things to say about the plant. The plant was running smoothly, full capacity. It was an unusually warm winter, which had held down orders a little bit. Nobody was worried. No layoffs were anticipated. It was also noted that in the last 25 years, this plant had added tremendously to the town's capital investment possibilities, to the encouragement of other plants to come here and enjoy all the good things Plainville offered. They had also worked without a protracted vacation for their help and had done a good deal for this town. In fact, what disturbed some people more than anything else about the plant was that now a lot of the stock was held by out-of-town, out-of-state stockholders. And all those premiums, all those dividend dollars were going out of Plainville. Now we're up to 1894, and we have another annual meeting of the stockholders being held. They're explaining large layouts of money for improvements and new machines, and these are all okayed. Then the whole board goes outdoors in front of the office building, and they're going to have a demo of the new force pump. Now everybody thinks, oh, ho hum, and they're chatting among each other, but the workmen turn on the force pump, and the water shoots up through the clear blue Plainville sky, clear over the cupola, the water glistening in the sunshine. Everybody's going, wow, look at this, all right. And they're waving their high hats in the air, and they're really excited because this not only is wonderful for the mill itself, but it offers possibilities for fire control for surrounding buildings. And soon, after this great demo that day, there are 2 factory fires, and the force pump at the knitting mill is a major factor in saving these nearby fires. So it's a step forward in fire protection in our town. In September 1896, the mill is running full force. There's a high point in the economy, and the mill is all lighted up at night. It must have been a beautiful sight. Not only the sound of the mill would sound like industry, but now the lights are on. And they bring in a dynamo, which is a type of a generator, so that they could have light on whatever floor they needed. If the girls down in one area were doing a big job, they would take the light down there, and it was a mobile kind of light. They had just introduced a new line of what they call mixed goods. It was linen, wool, and cotton, and the public was receiving this with great enthusiasm, and this is what had brought in all these orders. It was a great success for the knitting mill. Then in 1896, even another thing happened that was good for textile mills in general. McKinley passed a high tariff and import duty, which helped our mill products because it kept foreign products out. You had to pay such a great duty on English goods or Scottish woolens that you would prefer to buy Plainville goods even if they scratched. By 1897, 3 carloads of new machinery, the most modern kind available, was replacing the old English machines. There was a large Gannett machine, there were knitters, winders, and even cuff frames. Now this was cutting out some of the cottage crafts that had before been a spin-off at the mill. A 3,000-gallon water heater was installed, unheard of in its time, but this would offer a wonderful supply of water for washing the finished goods. In 1897, a small 1-story annex was added to the main plant. It ran along West Main Street, and it enlarged the mixing plant. It looked just like a wart on the side of the building. It wasn't taken into consideration how it was going to look on our pretty brick building. It was just built. In 1902, we're up into this century now, the Plainville Manufacturing Company was merged with the Bristol Manufacturing Company. You remember at the very beginning, we said that there was some association with the Bristol Manufacturing Company. We don't know exactly why they did this, but we guess it's because Bristol was really floundering and having financial troubles, and they were hoping to bring it back to scale by incorporating it with the Plainville Manufacturing Company. At Christmas time in 1907, the mill was only closed 1 day for the holiday. Some departments were so far behind and just needed to catch up that those machines were running red hot. Can you imagine the pandemonium in some of the mill workers' homes when both parents are working at the mill, and yet they're trying to get some Christmas presents. They're trying to plan a nice dinner. It was the old story that goes on eternally of the quality of life with your family being measured against the economic realities of living. In 1916, the mill again is rushed with military orders, but this time it's to keep the doughboys and girls warm and comfortable in Europe. Who knows how many pairs of Plainville drawers and shirts were present in the trenches in France? Maybe my daddy was wearing them. In 1917, part of the home front effort was a very interesting contest between the Bristol Mill and the Plainville Mill, which was known as the Bristol Mill, to see who could sell the most war bonds between the workers, and Plainville won hands down. In that publicity that was in the newspapers for that war bond competition, there was a very good and informative list of people who worked in the mill. They're listed as people participating, but now we see all these names coming up that we see again and again and again in the records of the knitting mill. By 1919, 20% of Plainville's, Connecticut's population, and Plainville's, was working in textile mills. Alas, in 1921, things really started to look bleak. Everything started to fall apart after the war. We didn't have those military orders coming in. People were losing their jobs. Things were slowing down to a crawl. Men coming back from the front, having gone through the horrors of the trench warfare in Europe, were not finding jobs available in our knitting mill. Newspaper accounts of the day, the knitting mill in 1921, say that the mill now has a large surplus of underwear of all kinds, sleepers, pajamas, etc. They open a mill store on Whiting Street. People can go in there and buy at very reduced prices, and one pictures a woman taking her children under protest in to be fitted for new winter underwear. Kids were not thrilled. But it was probably one of the first mill outlet stores in the state of Connecticut. Very interesting. This started a big trend. In 1922, the mill, now a shadow of its former self, pays only $12,000 worth of taxes, as opposed to Trumbull Electric, which is paying $502,000. It shows you things are really going downhill. In 1923, our lovely old stockinette building business applies for receivership. Company officials charges that the changing times were involved in the demise of the building and the manufactory. There's 250 people working. Things had looked good up to a year before, and then came the news. Workers get their layoff slips. Shock hits the town. Just a total loss of these jobs hurt the economic picture of the town of Plainville. They had struggled right up to the last, but now here's a major economic loss. Disbelief, not our mill, not our livelihood. It seemed to be going so well. How could this have happened? Desperation hits families in Plainville. Families lose their homes, they move away. Business ventures fail. All over town we have records of people going out of business, small builders just going bottom up, no money to continue, houses already in progress. It was some time before that slack of those knitting mills jobs being lost would be taken up. Now it's March 1926, a bleak day. The mill is put on the market. The old buildings are empty. For months, people have been in there taking out machines and equipment, and it's now just an empty shell. There's nothing in it. Onlookers watch with deep gloom. Hundreds of people are out of work. Its sister plant in Bristol has already shut down some time ago, some years ago. Desperate efforts are being launched to interest some other business in these huge empty buildings. For a while there was a rumor that someone would be bringing in an industry, but that proved to be wishful thinking. Then someone said, oh, there's a company coming in from Hartford that's going to rent the Pierce Street buildings as garages. That was wishful thinking. Standard Steel and Bearing Company moves into Plainville on Woodford Avenue. They would later be known to us as Marlin Rockwell Corporation. They did absorb quite a few of the people who were out of work. Some go to work at Trumbull Electric, and some go to New Britain to the Fafner Company. But now there's no hope left. The old mill stands empty and forlorn. Windows are broken. Vandals break in, and it becomes an eyesore. Very sad. This had been a major source of income. In July of 1926, Frank Cunningham will establish a diner on a little strip of land that he buys in front of the knitting mill on West Main Street. The huge empty hulk of the mill peeks over the shoulder of the tiny trolley car building. New life is springing from the old. The Plainville plant of the Bristol Manufacturing Company failed for several reasons. There was rumored financial mismanagement. However, this has never been substantiated. Management had to recognize certain things in the running of this mill. There were rising costs, not only for labor, but there was also an intense competition for these people who worked in these mills. There were other factories opening up around the area. The cost of the raw product was escalating. Shipping the cotton up from the south and shipping the wool in from Australia had gone through the ceiling. The shipping of the finished goods was also rising rapidly. The changing styles helped to kill the stockinette. Women were wearing shorter skirts and they were wearing thinner fabrics. No bulky underwear under those thin, shimmying dresses. And I would like to say, with all honesty and a degree of authenticity, that the Charleston was never done in a Plainville pair of Plainville long johns. The changing heating in homes, central heating had come in, and this also was a factor. People simply weren't wearing the long, heavy underwear. Stoves and heaters and furnaces were available now very inexpensively at the turn of the century, and in the Sears 1905 catalog, oil heating stoves were $3.15 with smokeless and wickless benefits. Radiators were $4.69. Bulky underwear was out. Turn up the heat and shed the bulkies. Many New England textile mills moved south. However, I have the feeling that this was never considered in Plainville and that Plainville simply faded away. The end has come, and in January 1934, the 19th day of that month was a very sad and bitter day for all the families who had worked at the stockinette, who had lived within the sound of their bell all their lives. The bell had regulated their lives, the mill had regulated their lives, and now the building is going down. The demolition of the buildings and the walls was rapidly progressing. It was done with sledgehammers and crowbars and man labor. There was not a lot of machinery involved with the knocking down of this building. There was little remaining by the 19th of January, this 5-story, huge, imposing building. We don't know when the office and the finishing mill buildings went down. Can you see the faces of the watchers as the workers whacked and hacked away at that structure that had nurtured them and nurtured their families? Sadness, maybe a little disgust, but on some of the faces of newcomers to town who hadn't remembered the glory days of our mill, the wonderful days, the camaraderie and the friendship, they probably were glad to see the old eyesore go. The newspaper report continues that after the building is leveled, it is expected that the tall smokestack will also be toppled by weakening it at its base. The knocking down of the smokestack was held up by a great blizzard that hit the day after January 19th, after the day that newspaper report came down. And it dropped 18 inches of snow in the Plainville area with large drifts accumulating. So now we move into February of that year, February 17th. Photographs show large piles of snow still at the demolition site, huge beams, great parts of the building. The lower structure that held the building up, the foundation, is still in place. I'm told that townspeople were told to come in and scavenger all the bricks, any of the wood that they wanted. They could take any parts of the knitting mill. So there may be pieces of that knitting mill all around town in other buildings. It would be kind of fun to know about that. Now the 85-foot giant smokestack stands ready to be torn down. It's towered over our town for 75 years. It comes down, breaking as it hits, before it hits the ground with 500 townspeople watching it. We don't know how they weakened it, but it may have been simply by knocking bricks out of the side to which they wanted it to fall and putting wedges under the other side. It's a cold, bitter morning, and all the onlookers are confined to the north side of West Main Street. They stand up on the steps of the stores over there. They're in front of the Strand Theater, keeping out of the wind. Everybody is very subdued. There's hardly any sound. And as the big smokestack hits the ground, a sound goes up almost like a groan from the townspeople. The photographs that we have were taken that morning by young Lee Williams, who had gone down to the site on his bicycle, took these historic pictures with his Brownie camera. Plainville Manufacturing Company was the first large employer in town to bring in lots of girls and women in a major industry. Previously to this, there were some women employed in a shop that manufactured clock dials, clock face dials. They painted them, and this was down by Blossom's Tavern. But this was the first large working area for young women and ladies. And really, home life was never the same after that. Women had left home, they found out about the good economic factors, and they weren't going to go back to the ironing board. Girls went to work at 15, and this was the job that most town children aspired to. When you get to be 15, you could go to work at the stockingette. The hours were long, but there was great camaraderie, especially among the women workers. The older women took care of the youngsters, and everybody got along just fine. In some of our photographs, you can see they're hugging each other in the picture, and it's almost a mother-daughter relation type of thing.
I made friends with one very special one, Kitty Garrity. She was so nice to me. She was a maiden lady, and she took to me because I was only a kid then. So I enjoyed it very, very much. I would really like to be back there again because I had some beautiful friends there. This particular lady was so kind to me. They were all kind, but there was one particular one, and I loved her so much. And she must have loved me too because she had patience with me.
As late as 1887, there were 1,600 children working in factories under 13 years of age. Now, we think of this kind of thing going on today. We do not realize that it went on then, perhaps in the textile mills here in Connecticut. Textile mills were definitely the worst offenders. In 1895, the state legislature took over and passed a law that said no child under 14 years old could work in the mills.
I know it was a great help to my mother because she was left with 5 children when I was 1 year old. My father passed away, and because she worked and my 2 sisters and my brother worked, I was the only one in my family that was able to go to high school. Before then, they all got through school when they graduated from the 8th grade. They were 14 years of age, so they were able to go to work. The working age then was 14 years old.
Now, even though the pay was low in that era, at one time girls were only making $2 a week, it was important money. That was a lot of money in those days.
When we got paid on Friday night, and 45 hours a week, $6. $6 and change. And, but that was a lot of money them days. 9 or 10 hours. Yeah, we used to work. And we go home, I was pretty tired. But you know, them days, you ate your supper, read the paper, and then go to bed, and get up at 5 to be ready for 7 o'clock, you know. Yeah, I didn't mind it.
The hours were 7 to 6, with an hour out for nooning. And if you were lucky, you lived close by, you went home, you had a warm lunch if the weather was pleasant. Otherwise, you carried a cold lunch. There was no cafeteria, no food service. You carried a cold lunch, and on a nice sunny day, you'd sit out on the loading platform, or you would sit out on the steps that faced West Main Street and had your lunch and chatted with passerbys and so forth. One wonderful picture shows us the girls sitting on the loading platform having had their lunch. Now they're eating lollipops. And it shows us a different side of the mill worker girls. We used to think of them as maybe underprivileged waifs. These girls are having a ball. There's laughter, there's smiles. They're well dressed. They're not starving by any means. It really belies that unhappy waif look. And then just look at this picture. This is a wonderful picture. These girls are clowning around, and that's the finishing mill in back of them because it's the only wooden building, remember. And they have borrowed some of the workmen's caps, and notice how young these girls are in this picture. This is a wonderful picture. It's a little light into a historical moment. Even though that pay was low, the impact on the town was very important. The girls would go and browse through the shops after work or during their nooning. They could get out on their nooning. They dressed decently on those wages, and they might spend $2.98 or $3.98 on a pretty little dress, or you could make your own buying a 15-cent dress pattern. These are the prices from 1890 catalogs. A smart little straw hat, such as we see in this lovely photograph of mill workers, only cost you 75 cents, and that included the ribbon. A pretty blouse might cost you 50 to 75 cents, and you could buy a gorgeous, long, full-length petticoat trimmed with lace for 55 cents. And oh yes, don't forget the ladies' summer underwear. The summer union suits were 85 to $1. However, in April of 1869, not all the workers were very, very happy with the knitting mill. That was the year our town was incorporated, breaking away from Mother Farmington, and there were unhappy workers. Some of them printed and distributed a broadside called The Worker's Friend, which was a long tirade against the knitting mill officials and the working conditions and what they thought was very bad things that the workers had to put up with. Perhaps they were emboldened by the air of independence because we were breaking away from Mother Farmington. But anyway, this large thing appeared and it was pinned up all over town and passed out, and it ends with this text: wanted to take the place of those who have just left. 50 girls to work in a knitting mill under lock and key to make the lowest wages, and the boss keeps a boarding house on his own. Applicants must therefore deposit $50 with the treasurer as security for their board, as their wages will prove insufficient. And it was signed by W.H. and W.R. at the Plainville Prison Company, number 2 West Main Street, which was the address of the Plainville Manufacturing Company, then known, of course, as the Bristol Manufacturing Company. So you see, there were dissidents even back in that far back in labor. Another source of income for Plainville people that was a spin-off from the mill were the cottage craft industries, and in the early years, finishing and buttonhole tapes and raveling the little cuffs so they would come out even were done at home. And one pictures a family after working a full shift or perhaps running a farm all day long, kind of tired, but they're sitting down at the kitchen table by kerosene lamp, and they're earning a little extra money. Stockinette was the name of the product that was made at the Plainville Manufacturing Company, and it was actually tubes of knitted material. It came off the knitting machine. If you wanted to make a union suit, for instance, you would use 5 different tubes, a large tube for the body plus your arms and your legs. The buttonholes in the finishing work on these garments were made, as we have seen, as a cottage craft for extra income for the local families. At no time early on in the knitting mill's history was any consideration given to the gender of the wearer of the union suit that was being made. But after a while they got smart and they started putting little pocket-like slits in the top of the apparel that was made for the women. Also, the ladies' underwear had split drawers and the men had drop seats, a nice distinction. So stiff was this fabric, before it was washed many, many times, that when you hung your underwear on the bedpost overnight, it became a very scary apparition in the darkness of the bedroom, and if you woke up and forgot it was hanging there, you could have quite a scare. Also, some of the fabric had a nap added to it to make it look more woolen, which was lovely when it was new, but after it was washed a couple times, that nap shed like the trees in autumn. By and large, I think the fabric and the product was probably as good, on average, as what was being made in the other knitting mills in the area. The Stockinette Company claimed to be part wool. They said their fabric was part wool, but a wag in the knitting mill, working on a machine, said that the only wool that ever came near that fabric was a very small lamb trotted very quickly through the knitting mill every morning. Despite the itch, garments made here were good sellers, and they sold in 1911 for $1 for a woman's union suit of light cotton, or heavy wool for $2. And union suits were called union suits because they were the union of a top and a bottom all in one garment. So itchy was the fabric of the Plainville Manufacturing Company's garments that they offered two kinds of warmth. The first was derived from the wearing of the garment, and the second was derived from the itching and scratching that you did. And they made you terribly thankful when spring came. In the 1920s, a last-ditch effort was spurred on to try to bring in more business because of this drop-off of after the wartime. A line of children's underwear and wrappers and pajamas was introduced, and it was very, very popular. It was called the Sandman line, and it was a patented trademark. This might have saved the company if it had been introduced a little earlier. So popular was these little garments. Beautiful material, lovely little patterns, and soft, soft fabric. Improved machines were really helping to produce these little garments. They decided to run a search for the perfect child to advertise their perfect little garments. And so they said to all the knitting mill employees, bring in your children and we're going to have a contest. Well, little Leo Cassidy, 2 years old, won hands down. Angelic little face, curly golden hair. He was the perfect child to advertise the perfect product. But still, these beautiful ads were not enough to save the old knitting mill. The girls and the women worked on many kinds of machines, and their fingers flew from dawn to dusk.
When I got the job, they put me on these machines. Now, they worked by themselves. All I had to do was watch them. And if the string broke, I had quick, you know, get them together and roll them with my finger. And you heal them, and they go right back to the spool again. And I used to form the material on top. And then when that was full, they'd take it down and they'd put the empty spool. And that was my job. And I had 7 machines I had to watch. But they always run good. I had no trouble. Once in a while, 1 or 2 during the day would snap, you know. And then when they were full, the machine would stop, and the fellas take them out, put the empty spool, and we start all over again.
There were stockinette machines. There were sewing machines. The job of filling these huge spools that had to be put on the machines was done by the girls, and then the men lifted them up because this was a big manual job. It took the strength to put those up on the machines. And each floor had its different operation.
Yeah, the reason the men used to take the spools off because they were big. We couldn't handle. Us kids, we could. All we had to do was watch them, and when they were, because we could put the empty spool. That was all right.
There were no safety devices to protect these workers from the machines, and sometimes fingers were smashed. Needles flew through the air after being broken off from hitting little imperfections in the fabric they were sewing. Needles also pierced fingers. The dangerous pulleys and reels and spinning spools moved in the immediate area of these long skirts and the long hair of these girls, and one day a girl learned to her great horror that her long hair was a hazard. Bending over her machine, the long hair caught in a spindle, and it's being rapidly wound around the spindle. The girl screams out, and her comrade to the next machine lunges forward, turns off her machine. My hair, my head. The girl's head is bleeding, but she's not scalped. They bring a rag. They put a coal rag on her head. She sits down, shaking on her stool, and she has to make the decision. Is she going to go home and lose a day's work, or is she going to stay there? This was a decision. There was no medical relief. There was no financial relief. After 1900, better working conditions, safer working conditions came in, and we started to see some medical relief for accidents such as this on the job. In the mill building, which was rather dark, there were very few lights in there, the ventilation was a problem because you couldn't have any fans going, and you really couldn't have the windows open if there was a breeze out there because all this cotton and wool product would be blowing all around. The girls near the windows were very privileged, of course, and they could have a little sunshine. They could have, if it wasn't windy, they could have a little window open. They also brought in green plants and had them draped around the windows, not only for pretty, but also for a little shade from the sun.
The working conditions for this particular knitting mills were pretty good, because I used to go in the factory on occasion to visit my mother or my sisters and my brother, and it was permitted. There was no objections, and the working conditions I remember were pretty good. The women sat at their benches in good chairs, and they worked at a sewing machine or iron clothes or something. I can just barely remember making those visits.
But out in the heart of the mill, remember this was a long building. It ran from the railroad tracks almost down to Pierce Street. In the heart of these floors, it must have been dismal. There was not a lot of light, and probably it was very hot there in the summertime. Now, there was no social area for the people to gather. For instance, for their nooning, we've seen that they ate out on the steps. There was no social area. The sanitation was very bad. There was one sink on each floor, and there was one two-holer, if you'll excuse the expression, on each floor. The girls liked to hang out the windows, but this was frowned on. It wasn't looked at as being ladylike, and the mill owners did not want them doing that. Most of the mill foremen were men, and this was very typical of the time. The men were the foremen, they were the bosses, and the women did their jobs. These men stayed for very long periods of time, lifetimes, work lifetimes. In 1899, Charles Thompson left the mill after 40 years. And in 1888, Lewis Hitchcock died at 52 years old. He had worked as long as his health would allow him to work at the mill, and then his son took over his job. Lewis Hitchcock had been in the 27th Connecticut Volunteers in the War of the Rebellion. Warren Reynolds, the power plant engineer, stayed 60 years. 60 years doing one job. This is unbelievable. Whole families worked at the mills. The mother, the father, as the kids got to be 15 years old, they would come in.
I had two sisters worked along with me in the sewing departments, and I had three brothers who worked doing handy jobs around the factories. So there were a lot of Hemingways there.
The Irish had come to Plainville to work on the canal. Now we had another influx of Irish coming to work in our knitting mill. In the 20th century, we had a lot of Italian people coming here to work in the mill, and they became very involved in Plainville affairs, Plainville enterprises such as building and working in stores and storekeeping. Annie Conlon was a floor lady. Her husband was a night watchman. Mary Ellen Cassidy worked first at the mill for a long time. Then she went over to Governor John Trumbull's after he was elected governor and worked as his cook. And she was known, strangely, as Nellie. Now, Tom Conlon was a tiny little man, perhaps 5'1", 5'2". He worked in the mill in the early 1920s, and he was known as a gentle person, a good-humored person, and he loved animals. Many's the time he took home a stray kitten that had been dropped at the mill in his old saggy sweater and took it home and took care of it. Tom had twinkly blue eyes and big, shaggy eyebrows, and his family was sure he looked like a leprechaun.
My name is Tom Conlon. I was born and lived in Plainville early in the 1900s. I went to work in the Plainville Knitting Mill, the stockinette as we called it. I live on Pierce Street, and it was there that I took me darling Andy on our wedding day. It's an easy walk up to the mill, and I'm a familiar sight going to work in my old sweater and cap, swinging my domed lunchbox. My job is a night watchman, and I take it mighty seriously. There's lots that can go wrong in that huge building, and the smaller ones too. I carry a watch clock that I punch at set intervals as I walk through the place. In the main building, the old floors creak, and on a windy night, though it is made of good solid brick, there are many strange noises. Bales of wool and cotton stand in ghostly piles in the dim light. The machines stand patiently waiting for an early dawn when the mill again will come alive. And then there's the bell, This is rung to get folks to work, and they ring it at 9 o'clock at night for the curfew to get people off the street and home. It keeps the town safe, I tell myself. Sometimes I get the word to ring the bell for a fire, but now an electric alarm system is putting the bell out of the picture. Well, it's time now to go home. The sun will be up soon. I'll pat the dog, get some sleep, and then do some odds and ends, and then it's back to the mill. That mill kind of takes over our lives, we that work there.
Later in the history of the mill, the Italian people joined the Irish people. But to start with, the Irish people were involved in spin-off trades. For instance, Jamie Nolan and Arthur O'Hara were builders, and they built many of the houses for the mill workers. Houses on Maple, Hamlin, Pierce, East Main Street, all housed these people. There was a strong iron fence all around the mill grounds, and this kept the people in, and who knows what they were trying to keep out. We've already seen the girls would go out and sit on the steps at lunchtime, and they were allowed out during the nooning. Then those gates were locked. And to see the workers lined up to be let out at the end of the working day gave rise to only the half-jesting name of the Plainville jail. The fact was that the fact that they were locked in is now, in retrospect, very frightening, because there was very little for fire protection in those days. And in 1890, an insurance company noted in its study of the mill that there was no steam engine fire trucks in Plainville, and there was no help available from other mills in the area. So if a fire had broken out, what happened to these people locked into this fence? It would have been a frightening scene. Most mills in the 1850s had bell towers, and our bell tower was a little prettier than most, certainly prettier than our sister plant in Bristol. The bell sounded in the morning to call people to work. It also sounded curfew at 9 o'clock at night, and this sent people scurrying home to get off the streets, and soon the streets were very empty and peaceful. The clocks in town were set by the bell on the knitting mill. Whether or not the bell was right, the clocks were still set by the knitting mill bell.
And that bell used to ring exactly at 6 o'clock. And the whole town of Plainville knew it was 6 o'clock. Gee, I used to love to hear it. Come on, kids, come on, get ready. There goes the bell. I wonder what they did with that bell.
On a stormy day, we really did listen for that bell, because if that ever rang, we knew there was no school, then we'd be jumping around with glee.
In August of 1877, we read, the bell in the knitting mill has been long mute on account of it being a little cracked. And it's now found its tongue, it's loosened up, and it's ringing merrily, calling people from their refreshments to their labor and vice versa. The inhabitants rejoice at the silence of that abominable steam whistle and welcome back their lovely bronze bell. When the mill was to be demolished, it appeared in the paper that a plan had been made that the bell would be given to First Selectman Pryor to be displayed in the town hall, and then later a permanent place of display was to be found for it. After the mill had closed down and it was dark and forlorn, kids used to break into the mill and they would ring the bell on Halloween and also on the 4th of July Eve.
In those days, Plainville was quite a center for celebrating the 4th of July, especially the night before, which was the 3rd of July. People came from all the surrounding towns, New Britain, Bristol, Southington, Farmington, and some even came from further away, just to shoot off firecrackers all night long on the 3rd of July. And one other thing that was quite a thing that some of the bolder people did was to get together and somehow or other get inside of the bell tower of the stockinette, get up there to where the bell was and hook it up and ring it approximately around midnight. And they rang it for 5 or 10 minutes. And that was the celebration. But they weren't supposed to do it, but they did, you know, and they got away with it.
Now, by some slip of the hand of fate, the bell is in private hands away from Plainville. There were no medical benefits, no first aid room for the workers in the knitting mill. If you were hurt and you couldn't work, tough luck. One hot July day in 1892, Miss Giselle Hinman arrived for work. The day was oppressive and it was hot. It was one of those sticky July days, and inside the mill, yesterday's heat hung like a blanket around her machine. No air moved. The day progressed very slowly. Then, suddenly, a sweating hand slips. Oh, no, she holds up her hand. The blood is streaming down her hand, streaming wildly. She screams, my hand, the tip of my finger is gone. The Ashen girl looks ready to pass out. She's ready to go into shock. They sit her down. They run a rag around the bleeding hand, and it wicks the blood down onto the lint-covered floor. Did the doctor come to her? We know it was Dr. Buell. He was around the corner on Whiting Street. Is she taken to his office on Whiting Street in one of the freight wagons? We don't know. Who paid him? We don't know. History doesn't tell us this. We do know that fellow workers and mates raised a purse of $30 for her, and the paper said it was a very substantial fund and very duly appreciated. Was Giselle able to work with that disabled hand, or was she to become one of the 19th century many industrial cripples with no benefits? When she was 15 years old, Anna Grannis, our town poetess, Anna Jane Grannis, went to work in the knitting mill, staying for 5 years. In later years, she would say that the poems that she wrote about her co-workers and about the old mill were not polished and finished because she just didn't have the time. In the vernacular of the mill, they were skipped stitches, which means an unfinished or flawed product. And that's what she called her little book of the poems that she wrote about the mill. She never had a vacation. She never left Connecticut. She never married. In her later years, she was a teacher, a social worker, and an early environmentalist. All kinds of women worked at that mill. Soft-spoken and gentle, Anna felt a great comradeship with the ladies that she worked with in the mill, and that's why she wrote about them. Down through the ages, above the steam-driven sounds of the machines, above the whine of the pulleys, that old mill speaks to us through Anna Grannis, through her little book of poems called Prelude, published in 1898.
And so, when the days and seams are long, when the pulleys creak and moan, I just skip a stitch and sing a song. But the world has never known that it soothes the ache of hurts and wrongs, that brighter the needle gleams in threading life through the simple songs that go tucked away in seams.
The old mill is just a shell of its former self. It's in disgrace. It's an eyesore. The people gather that last day to watch the fall of the chimney, that chimney that was so carefully and so lovingly and with such hope built back in 1856. The town says goodbye to the old knitting mill. I wonder if anyone watching on that February morning in 1934 echoed Anna Grannis's lines when she said, "Goodbye, old mill. I'm with you to the last. Your going dropped the curtain on our